Demand-Avoidance Phenomena, or in brackets, Pathological or Extreme Demand Avoidance as a Biopower Identity by Richard Woods, a PhD student at London South Bank University. This is a slightly expanded talk that I delivered yesterday, which was the 19th of October 2021, at a workshop / seminar held by the Participatory Autism Research Collective, or PARC for short. It's slightly expanded for a couple of reasons. One, because due to various factors related to my PhD, lack of spoons and other commitments, and just reflecting on the topic, on the material to put into the talk, I basically barely finished putting together the PowerPoint before I delivered the talk at about 6 o'clock yesterday evening. So I've put in other relevant points as relevant or as required. I pre-read it and I fully inserted references and that kind of side of it. So I'm going to get the background out of the way and kind of move on to the actual talk. It should probably be about 40 to 45 minutes-ish, I'm guessing, because I'm not going to rush this and I'm going to take it at a nice good pace. So yeah. So introduction. So this should be including the DAP profile of ASD outlook, and I need to be quite clear that my preferred terminology for pathological demand avoidance is demand avoidance phenomena, because it's a neutral term and it still validates lived experience of what's going on. There's substantial dislike for the pathological descriptor of PDA, so I'm going to be referring to it as DAP throughout my kind of talk. So yeah, so basically the situation around kind of DAP in the UK, the challenges and the kind of lack of consensus over what DAP is, kind of broader research kind of practice and research standards, kind of overlook theoretical issues and kind of practical implications of kind of the DAP profile of autism spectrum disorders. Well, I don't even believe in autism spectrum disorders, as in like there's multiple disorders under autism. I think there's only one singular disorder, a heterogeneous one, but that's a tangent. Just how the kind of debate around DAP seems being controlled by various notable kind of advocates for the DAP profile of autism, then how basically the DAP profile of autism has been used to control various kind of persons within the autism community. So yeah. So a bit more about myself. So I'm autistic. I was diagnosed with Asperger's in 2012, but I just tend to say that I'm autistic. I meet Elizabeth Neaton's kind of that profile, but I'm not invested in it or attached to it at all emotionally. I just meet it from a lived experience perspective, and that's basically my only kind of reason why I'm stating it. There's been a recent article by Monique Bertha, it's been quite provocative in some respects, but he's there to kind of make autism stakeholders reflect and consider how our values kind of shape our understanding and construction of autistic people, or kind of constructs or other kind of disorders which are inherently social constructs, because they're abstract representations of characteristics seen within kind of human beings. So yeah, my agenda is therefore to be at least inclusive, good quality, scientific method-based research and practice, and this is something that I am very passionate about. I think that there's a lot of the problems in the autism literature and autism practice is because of persons being dogmatic to the views and not being open-minded to being mistaken. Because that's quite important, because you can't do scientific research if you're not willing to be mistaken, not willing to be wrong. In order to do science, you have to be willing to change your mind and to be mistaken. It's quite odd, because personally, I'm in favour of a transdiagnostic approach to kind of mapping and kind of describing kind of characteristics associated with kind of mental disorders, and I think that we should be aspiring to stop utilising disorders within in the future over the next kind of 3 or 4 decades. And I am a PhD student investigating DAP as part of the Critical Autism / Disability Studies group at London South Bank University. So yeah, these are a couple of kind of bit about my kind of perspective more. So one of my PhD aims is to investigate the potential cultural impact of the outlook DAP profile ASD has upon the DAP literature and the public, and I'm working from for a definition for critical autism studies by Mitzi Waltz, which is The criticality comes from investigating power dynamics that operate in discourses around autism, questioning deficit-based definitions of autism, and being willing to consider the ways in which biology and culture intersect to produce disability. The reason I'm using this definition is I never put it forward as a more inclusive definition in an article in 2018. So here's my conflict of interest. I'm giving them because I am highly critical of some prominent DAP Profile of ASD supporters not declaring a conflict of interest. And they do have them in quite big ways in some respects. So yeah, I've been developing various tools for DAP, such as Pathological Demand-Avoidance Belief Scale. I have some income from delivering training sessions on DAP, and I am part of the London South Bank University Critical Autism Studies / Disability Studies group. And I also reluctantly advocate for DAP to be diagnosed as a standalone construct at lower diagnostic thresholds. And this is coming back to my own personal perspective that we should be going for a transdiagnostic approach and aiming to stop using disorder-based constructs. So yeah, this, a bit more background is this talk builds on a previous talk I delivered at the 2018 Park conference in July 2018. So most people should be familiar with how the right media controls the public in the UK by kind of making a person kind of angry or scared at a particular topic, and thus they become highly aroused, and so they're processing information more slowly, more emotively on a particular given topic. The similar kind of practice happens within kind of autism studies. So, for example, a lot of the kind of dominant narratives around autism is that it's a horrible, dangerous thing that kind of robs kind of children and kind of caregivers of the opportunities to have a kind of normal life. And so a lot of kind of, there's a lot of money and a lot of interventions out there that are aimed or designed to try and make autistic persons kind of normal or conform to kind of normal expectations, to kind of give normal life opportunities back to the autistic kind of children and to their kind of caregivers and stuff. Not that like that many of them work, if any of those interventions will do. This is kind of also more important. I'm quite a big fan of this both a 2021 article. So in this article, it's pointed out that what is kind of said in the academic literature does make it into broader kind of culture. So, for example, is kind of autism is often kind of more heavily associated with males than with females, and that it's kind of a male-based construct. So, some people have, one person's proposed like the extreme male brain theory of autism. So, what this has led to is some clinicians having a biased view of what autism looks like, and this can be a barrier to diagnosing or identifying autistic females. And this has been picked up in a systematic review last year. So this is a quote from anthropologist Rory Grinker. So I'm going to read a quote out. So once a diagnosis takes hold and serves as the hub around which so much wealth, so many people and activities coalesce, it takes on a life of its own as an authentic, naturalised classification. This category in turn provides an incentive for manufacturing people with the diagnosis of autism whose presence and needs support this financial infrastructure. I think this situation has exactly happened with the DAP Profile of ASD and autism. I mean, sorry, in the UK. And there's good signs to kind of support that outlook. So a bit about the main DAP discourse in the UK. So for the DAP kind of Profile of ASD, it's kind of either called kind of pathological demand avoidance or extreme demand avoidance. Was originally a pervasive mental disorder, is now a kind of rare autism profile subgroup or subtype, which clinically they're the same thing when you kind of dig into it and kind of compare them, and that DAP has its own kind of strategies that are unique and are different from those practiced with other kind of autistic persons, and that's assuming you assume DAP to be a form of autism, which I personally don't, which is something I kind of touch upon in this talk. So diagram basically has DSM-5 kind of autism criteria on the left and the aggregated DAP profile on the right. The reason why it's aggregated is because there's multiple different DAP profiles in print. So I've aggregated them together and kind of put forward what I think is kind of compulsory and what is kind of optional for DAP, and where there's areas of overlap between kind of autism and DAP, and where areas are different. So there's quite a lot of debate around what features are optional and what are compulsory for DAP, and this is my view. Some people might disagree with me. The core traits are kind of core because basically they're meant to be developed and maintained by a negative reinforcement cycle that's linked to anxiety, which I will kind of cover in a talk later. It is widely recognised that anxiety is not a feature of autism, so it's why those RBIs do not overlap the autism RBIs. Again, a bit kind of, I don't have time to go into the full kind of ins and outs of this diagram, but I just want to point out the reason why there's overlap between the kind of social communication issues for DAP and autism is because DAP is meant to have social communication issues are meant to be caused by different sets of deficits. So in autism, it's meant to be theory of mind deficits, while for DAP, it's meant to be deficits in social identity, pride, or shame. But some autistic persons pass through mind tests, so because that there is theoretically some overlap between them. So I'm being honest in kind of representing that. So the current situation with DAP in the UK is that kind of prominent DAP profile of ASD kind of researchers have been basically researching DAP from their understanding of autism, and that basically caregivers are often highly motivated to take part in research. It's gotten to the point now where interest in the DAP profile of ASD has substantially, or if not completely, outstripped the evidence base to kind of support it, and this should be sending alarm bells. It's recognised that the DAP profile of ASD is a kind of culture-bound concept to the UK, and we should be asking ourselves, and I will be in this talk asking, should we even be in this situation? I would point out that due to kind of campaigning efforts for to have kind of DAP recognised by kind of local and national governments in the UK, it can lead to people kind of being on the lookout for it, and is a potential source of bias on the topic, which I would kind of consider. I would ask people to kind of reflect upon how their own kind of values for it might shape their kind of understandings and conceptualizations on the topic. As I said, should there be a bubble of the DAP profile ASD in the UK? I would quite emphatically and definitively say no. I would point out that the proponents of the DAP profile ASD would probably argue that it should be a globally accepted construct. So I should probably get that bit out the way, but I need to point out the broader kind of construct, the context around the kind of that profile. It is recognised in the literature that it is controversial, in a highly controversial topic. More recently, reputable independent parties concluded there's no good quality evidence to suggest what DAP is or what features are associated with it, and they treated divergent opinion equally on the topic. And it includes kind of like NICE, which is the kind of body that kind of helps set guidelines for kind of health treatments and kind of interventions, and how to kind of assess for stuff like ADHD and autism and stuff. So these aren't exactly parties that you can be, that you should be ignoring. You should basically be following the lead of NICE. Also, DAP itself has been consistently and robustly challenged for almost 2 decades, since 2002, by multiple parties, quite a lot by myself, as you can probably tell. But what I'm trying to point out is that the DAP profile of ASD supporters have been engaged and challenged frequently and often enough that they probably should be listening to some of the critique instead of just this kind of favouring their own views on the topic, which we'll kind of cover later in the talk. There's also multiple schools of thoughts on the topic. The main ones are alternative ones to it being a form of autism, is that it's a common mental health disorder, and potentially a new disorder which was proposed by Christopher Gilberg in 2013. Damien Milton, slightly building on kind of Lorna Wing's and Judy Gould's critique in 2002, suggested that DAP might be kind of rebranded autism. So what that means is it's pathologizing features that are not naturally pathologized in an autism diagnosis. So if you look at the kind of features associated with DAP, they contrast the autism ones. So it's kind of stuff like making eye contact, kind of like having a social life, and this kind of stuff. And the final kind of vascular thought, which we'll kind of cover about later on in the talk, is that symptoms with the interaction between autism and current conditions could basically be a pseudo syndrome and not a proper disorder. So moving on, just a quick diagram to who showed that there are diagnostic thresholds within the literature on DAP. So what you got here is frequency intensity of demand avoidance kind of features on the left hand side, and the bottom is basically kind of prevalence. These is kind of relational. The problem is it's really hard to kind of put definitive numbers attached to these. Because even in literature it's acknowledged that we can't actually kind of measure the severity of demand avoidance, all the kind of triggers of the avoidance features, and that kind of stuff. So at the top, what I need to tell you is that above Wing et al., basically DAP is only seen in autistic persons. Beneath Wing et al., DAP is seen in non-autistic persons, because it's more recently been recognised that there are non-autistic persons in Newson et al.'s clinical cohort. So there is some non-autistic persons in there. So yeah. So moving forward, there's quite a good case that DAP is seen in non-autistic persons. So these are 10 different studies which, or literature mentioning studies that show that kind of DAP is seen in non-autistic persons, and there's 2 probable studies which show that contain non-autistic persons in there. Just due to the nature of the circumstances of studies, it's hard to be definitive on it, and also multiple experts are saying that DAP is seen in non-autistic persons, and I've kind of put here that some people might disagree with this interpretation literally because some people might. So I'm trying to be quite clear what I'm trying to be clear on is that there's no real consensus on it, and a lot of this is just interpretation of the literature. So and I'm trying to kind of say what some people might disagree with and not. This is also quite important. If you actually check the front of DSM-5, which is there's 2 main diagnostic manuals, but the one that tends to be used often in research is the American version, which is, don't ask me to kind of give its full name, but the abbreviation is a DSM-5. It's quite clear that the natures of disorders is that they kind of present, they tend to present as continuums in the human population, and that people are kind of fluid and transient within these kind of constructs over the course of life in different situations. And because this can be quite hard for to work out when a feature becomes kind of pathological in nature, so there's a generic kind of term that most disorders in the DSM-5 have, and this term is the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. When you're kind of looking at in the DAP literature, it's quite clear where it actually is met. So it's either kind of start to display avoidant behaviour and challenging behaviour in response to particular stressor, or it's around the kind of threshold for the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire, or when kind of DAP becomes problematic demand avoidance. The problem with this is that the term problematic itself as a descriptor is very vague and subjective. So for some people it might mean different things at different kind of thresholds. But yeah, so moving on, I'm kind of talking a bit more about clinical arguments around DAP, and this kind of matters because one of the main kind of clinical arguments around DAP is that basically it has its own set of strategies that persons with DAP need to receive. So Newson was a person who discovered or created, depending on your view on the topic, she's quite clear in her article about certain strategies that are required to work. So these are kind of like praise, reward, reprove, and punishment are ineffective, and behavioural approaches fail. Teachers tend to need great variety of strategies, not rule-based. Novelty helps, and kind of indirect praise. And she has non-autistic persons in her cohort. It kind of these approaches are applicable to autistic and non-autistic persons with DAP. More recently, due to lack of consensus on the topic, it's been argued under the Convention on the Rights of a Child that children and young persons can receive a DAP diagnosis. And these are universal rights, so they're not just applicable to autistic children or young persons, they're applicable to non-autistic children and young persons with DAP. So this is kind of important for me to make on later. So if you look more later literature, we kind of mentioned that the thing with the DAP features is that they're meant to be a person's only kind of coping mechanism when they're kind of stressed. So when they're experiencing kind of high anxiety levels from the environment. So it's kind of argued that reinforcement-based approaches like positive behaviour support or applied behaviour analysis can basically extinguish those kind of features, removing the kind of only coping mechanisms that persons with DAP actually have. This can obviously be quite harmful and deleterious to a person's well-being. So it's argued that DAP diagnosis is needed to protect children and persons from kind of caregiving interventions for kind of disruptive behaviour disorders or PBS or ABA. But as I would point out, is that it's argued that kind of DAP in non-autistic persons has similar mechanisms, so they would also need protecting from kind of caregiver interventions for disruptive behaviour disorders. The flip side of this is that RRBI, so this is restrictive and repetitive behaviours and interest in autistic persons, such as stimming. Stimming tends to be used to as a kind of coping mechanism to reduce our stress levels or anxiety levels. And often the focus of ABA or PBS is to extinguish or remove kind of stimming behaviours. So effectively, you're given DAP diagnosis to only a minority of autistic persons. You're only protecting a minority of autistic persons from ABA or PBS, when effectively the vast majority of the autistic population should be protected from ABA or PBS, and there's the same arguments around this kind of clinical need for it. The reason why I mention this is because if you're only diagnosing DAP in I think it's a form of autism, diagnosing a minority of autistic persons, you're effectively discriminating against autistic persons generally, because they should also be protected from ABA and PBS, but you're also discriminating against non-autistic persons with DAP, because they have the same rights to kind of research, diagnoses, and support as autistic persons with DAP do, such as under the kind of under the Convention for Rights of a Child. So, and this does matter. So, if you can look at kind of professional ethical guidelines and standards, so the HCPC stands for the Health and Care Professions Council, which is the regulator for about 15 different kind of professions. But in relation to DAP, it matters because it regulates. It's a regulator for kind of practicing psychologists, speech and language therapists, and occupational therapists, and these would basically include many of the kind of prominent DAP Profile of ASD proponents would kind of fall under its umbrella. So if you check its basic professional guidelines, which are there to protect the public, is that you're not meant to discriminate. So they basically should be discriminated against autistic persons or non-autistic persons with DAP. And they should be challenging any discrimination. They should also be kind of giving service users and carers information they may want or need. And they must make sure that any promotional activities they are involved in are kind of accurate and not likely to mislead. And they must also declare issues that might create conflicts of interest and make sure they do not influence their kind of judgment and stuff. And this is quite important because I think that kind of some prominent DAP Profile of ASD supporters are probably likely to be transgressing such kind of standards. And more broadly, even the kind of literature around kind of autism studies and stuff, persons should be given balanced, accurate information on the topic, and also that researchers should be attempted to falsify their hypotheses, not conduct research which intrinsically favours one outlook over another. The research should be neutral to multiple possibilities. So what this means is they should not be conducting research that predispose it to be a form of autism and basically favours that outlook over other outlooks. So more broadly within autism studies, we know that autistic persons are systemically kind of treated poorly by wider society. This is by multiple kind of statistics around us. And we also know that a lot of autism research and practice is poor quality. I know that poor quality research is often associated with poor quality ethics. So there's kind of other wider issues. So there's like, for instance, there's a theory to research the practice gap in a lot of the interventions-based research. There's generally a lack of good quality theories for autism, and a lot of the kind of pathologizing theories of autism, so that ones that views are having kind of deficits or kind of like we're missing parts, so that we're basically not fully human, they tend to be poor quality, tend to have weak evidence, and their associated interventions also often kind of lack efficacy as well. And I'd also point out there tends to be a lack of inclusion in autism research generally. The reason I'm saying this is because the wider situation in autism studies is actually quite crap. It's not good. And because of this, people and some groups are striving to kind of improve autism research and practice standards. So this is a kind of broader context of this kind of DAP profile ASD is kind of existing in. So yeah, I did a citation survey in 2019 which indicated that DAP profile ASD has formed a community of practice. Generally from engaging in literature, they tend to ignore a lot of different topics in order to portray their view, which I'll kind of go into. They generally do not reference or portray divergent outlooks on a topic in their kind of writings on it, or kind of conference talks. For example, so a couple of the kind of more prominent advocates for DAP profile ASD, so kind of like Phil Christie or Liz Nyons, they never referenced the first critical article on DAP in print, which is kind of an indicator. And yeah, if you're trying to make DAP a profile of autism, you should be contextualizing in debates around kind of autism subtypes, or even if you're trying to push it as a kind of equivalent to a disorder, they should be kind of contextualized in broader debates around the kind of utility of disorders and if we should even be using disorders and stuff. And these debates are largely absent from the DAP literature. And some of these debates kind of matter because, for example, the autism subtyping literature is widely acknowledged that basically all attempts to divide autism have failed. So if you're having research results that indicate that DAP is different to autism, it would indicate that DAP is not a form of autism, and these kind of results are happening. So I'm going to go on to kind of Newton's own original research, because if you kind of analyse and pay attention to Newton's research, it's obvious that it's highly problematic making it kind of fit into accepted kind of definitions of autism, understandings of autism. So Newton's kind of constructs of kind of DAP and pervasive mental disorders do not equate to accepted diagnostic norms. So clinically, like over the last 30 years, the autism spectrum, it's essentially the same, although it has changed. So the main changes is that we went from subtypes in a DSM-4, and that was from 1994, to having a single spectrum diagnosis in a DSM-5 in 2013. So what's happened is that the three autism subtypes, which were pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified, Asperger's syndrome, and autistic disorder, were collapsed down into one diagnosis, and that sensory issues were added to the criteria in the DSM-5, and that instead of it being based on triad of impairment, the triad of impairment was collapsed down to a dyad of impairment. But essentially, it was the changes from DSM-4 to DSM-5 they were done to be equivalent, so that a DSM-4 autism diagnosis can be viewed as being the same thing as a DSM-5 autism diagnosis. So this matters. So Newton never based DAP on the triad of impairment, and she knew about it from the early 1980s. Newton's also quite clear in her supplementary notes to her article that she considers the autism spectrum to be only Asperger's syndrome and autistic disorder, which is obviously narrower than the DSM-4 one. And due to how Newton's pervasive mental disorders grouping contains specific language impairments which lack RIBIs, so her pervasive mental disorders did not need to have RBIs, so they're actually different from the accepted kind of versions of pervasive mental disorders. The other issue is that Newton did not view DAP to be a form of autism. She said it would be a mistake to view it as such, and her grouping of pervasive mental disorders is different to the accepted grouping within DSM-4. It's actually much broader and includes non-autistic persons, and this matters because her version of the residual category for the pervasive mental disorder, which is PD-NOS, which stands for pervasive mental disorder not otherwise specified, includes non-autistic persons in there, while the DSM-4 version of PD-NOS is only for persons who did not meet threshold for autistic disorder or Asperger's syndrome. And Newton was also quite clear in her article, she excluded persons who displayed autism features, and she also said that DAP needs to be substantially different from the autism spectrum. So, I'd also say that recent literature would indicate that DAP is a distinct clustering of features that is different to autism, which I'll kind of go on to next. So, this is diagram from Liz O'Nine's PhD thesis in 2013. It's a bit weird that she's not put it in any of her articles, but what she's basically saying here is that Newton's version is very narrow and it has a very kind of it's a bit like a magpie kind of taking different kind of features and traits from multiple kind of accepted constructs. So kind of one end she's got 5 kind of bars for kind of accepted constructs. So she's got like callous and emotional traits, conduct problems, inattention / hyperactivity, emotional symptoms / anxiety, and autism features. And she's got from one end is kind of being kind of mild impairment to severe impairment at the other, and where they all kind of overlap, she says that's Newton's kind of concept for it. More recently, I've kind of looked at the evidence and gone, this is kind of my Venn diagram for kind of how you can represent DAP. So I would say that DAP as itself has a spiky profile and has features of kind of ADHD, autism, kind of atypical obsessive defiant disorder or conduct disorder, kind of trauma, and kind of anxiety all kind of lumped together. And this is kind of going from kind of empirical results and that kind of side of it. So yeah, this next diagram is taken from kind of a Nyon and Eaton 2021. So this is based on some research by Liz Nyon. So what she's showing here is essentially the negative reinforcement cycle, which I mentioned earlier. So this is how basically DAP features are meant to be developed and maintained. So basically, kind of some kind of routine demand or kind of task causes some kind of distress or anxiety. This can kind of lead to kind of future demands, but basically, the anxiety stress can lead the child or person to display avoidance or escape behaviours in an effort to get some kind of temporary relief from the anxiety or distress. And because they get this temporary relief, they get it is negatively reinforced. So I built on this and the obsessive compulsive disorder cycle to kind of propose the demand management cycle. And this is a generic negative feedback cycle within the kind of mental health literature when you actually kind of go into it, consider it, and you kind of talk to people. So what you'd have is you have a demand, which kind of is a kind of equivalent to an obsession, so it's kind of internal, external, kind of causes some kind of anxiety or distress. And then the person would express some kind of avoidance, either rational or irrational in nature, which would be equivalent to a compulsion, and they will get some kind of temporary relief from that, and then it becomes negatively reinforced. So over time, it can generalize and kind of become kind of hot-wired or kind of cue to respond to kind of any kind of demands or stimuli. So yeah, kind of other points to kind of mention. So if I kind of go back to even Liz Nyon's image or my own one, from a logic perspective, if DAP contains features that are not associated with autism or outside of autism, it logically cannot be a form of autism. So, for example, basic logic will tell you A plus B plus C does not equal A. Also, kind of more importantly than that, anxiety itself is widely accepted to not be a feature of autism, but a co-occurring difficulty. And this kind of matters when it's basically meant to be an anxiety-driven disorder or kind of phenomenon within human beings. So when you kind of give an example, so this is from kind of Eaton and Weaver, which is more kind of recent topic. So while such excuses did at times seem comical, it was always important to remember that these children whose anxiety appear to be driving their needs to be avoidant. So yeah, the problem with this is that this is from research that views DAP to be a form of autism and only diagnoses DAP in autistic persons, and it's from a clinic that is meant to be well known for their awareness and understanding of DAP Profile of ASD, and they're basically diagnosing DAP as a form of autism. I would argue in the DSM-5 and the NICE guidelines, they view anxiety or anxiety disorders to be a co-occurring condition to autism. Diagnosing DAP as a profile of autism is unlikely to conform to your DSM-5 or NICE guidelines. Yeah, so I would expect kind of helpful psychology / student to be quite annoyed with me saying that, but we don't particularly agree on my interpretation of their research. Yeah, so this is kind of definition for conflict of interest from a recent kind of systematic review into kind of early interventions by Kristen Boitema-Boutel over in the US. So the definition for a conflict of interest is conflicts of interest can be potential in brackets, i.e. benefits have not yet occurred or are not occurring at the time of research but could occur in the future, close brackets / actual, i.e. benefits have already occurred or continuing to occur, kind of close brackets, kind of, or perceived, i.e. there are no potential actual benefits that have accrued or could accrue to the author, but such benefits are reasonable perception. So that's again kind of close brackets. So whilst most discussed types of COIs are those that involve direct financial transactions, they also extend to professional or personal relations, ideological commitments, and or religious or political views. I would also kind of put out that this actually doesn't matter. So if you're kind of viewing DAP to be DAP to be a profile of ASD, and bear in mind that DAP is not recognised in diagnostic manuals. It's not diagnosed universally across the UK or in all kind of clinics. There's substantial disagreement with it and dislike towards it. So if you're having kind of situations where, for example, kind of DAP supporting charity is working with kind of the government and other stakeholders as part of the recent autism the recent England autism strategy, considering that there's lack of evidence to support the outlook of DAP as a profile of autism, it's quite reasonable to refer that some people are benefiting from kind of campaigning efforts or kind of portrayals of DAP as a profile of autism. So yeah, profile of ASD supporters generally tend to be ignoring conflicts of interest, which, as I said, they should be declaring under kind of ethics and professional standards. So, kind of mentioned Julie Eaton before. She has recently published about 4 different DAP articles over the last 4 years. And if you check what their potential conflicts of interest are, nowhere are they mentioned. So they would include kind of advocating for it. So they've been involved in the Being Misunderstood report. So they helped design it or were consulted on it. And the Being Misunderstood report has been used to kind of advocate for that to be viewed as a profile of autism, both at the national and local level in the UK. And bear in mind that kind of Julie Eaton views that to be a profile of autism. They've kind of created a tool for that. They've used that to be a profile of autism. They've not declared a kind of as a conflict of interest and involvement with kind of Liz Lyons and Francesca Happe as a project to kind of try and kind of stabilise kind of DAP as a profile of ASD, and their kind of involvement in the PDA development group is generally not kind of widely acknowledged or recognised as a conflict of interest. The PDA development group is quite important, which I'll kind of discuss later, and also it's quite important that is something also Julie Eaton herself has been. She works for. She has her own independent kind of private clinic that specialises in autism and in kind of diagnosing that profile of ASD. So yeah, and it's also quite important to note that at least in one of the recent articles, they acknowledge that they are from independent clinics. So they and they say in the article they have no COIs when they quite clearly do. And more recently, it's kind of been concerted effort by certain DAP profile of ASD supporters to basically limit / reduce debates on the topic. So arguably it's leading expert, and I am saying that in quotation marks, Phil Christie has repeatedly kind of said in print that we debating DAP, what it could be kind of distract from the purpose of a diagnosis, as in diagnosing it as a form of autism. And in his recent conference talk, he's been kind of mentioned that we should be maintaining integrity of how the condition is understood. Yeah, I've also pointed out that quite often certain kind of DAP profile ASD and kind of proponents just view it to be a form of autism, and multiple kind of studies have basically been done into kind of DAP have kind of either used entirely or suspect entirely autistic kind of population samples, and this is by the kind of the authors of these kind of researchers' perspectives, because I and others would point out that there are some non-autistic persons in those samples. So Yeah, as I said previously, it can be argued that some DAP Profile ASD supporters do seem to be benefiting from control and debate around it. I mentioned the PDA Society is working with the government due to England's kind of 2021 autism strategy, despite lacking good quality evidence support their outlook. And if you actually check the actual autism strategy, nowhere does it mention DAP itself in there. And I also kind of mentioned that in two of G.'s recent articles, it is acknowledged that actually they are well known for kind of having a good awareness of the DAP profile of ASD and got to get loads of referrals from it and that kind of side of it. And this kind of matters if you go back and kind of consider definition for conflict of interest. It does include stuff like kind of, they don't even have to be financial. It can extend to kind of professional, personal relationships, kind of ideological commitments, or kind of religious and political views. Which obviously can be viewed if basically a charity is working with the government with basically little to no evidence to support, of any note to support their position on the topic. So, yeah, there's also going to be problematic issues with. I'm going to go back to kind of Phil Christie. So what's happened is that the PDA Development Group, which is a committee that was set up in 2011, I believe, after one of the National Autistic Society kind of conferences on DAP. Basically, what the PDA Development Group did is it at the time, for a while, it was basically responsible for controlling the information on National Autistic Society's website on DAP, and they also set the agenda for NAS's DAP conferences and who spoke there. There's a couple of issues. That the first one would be that basically often members of the presumably members of the PDA Development Group would also often speak at said conferences, and they've also kind of argued that the NAS conferences have generated interest in DAP in the UK that has biased persons' views and has led persons to be on the lookout for DAP. So what it means in practice is that the persons who were responsible for setting the agenda for kind of National Autistic Society's DAP conferences were also talking it, are also responsible for creating the kind of the interest that is leading people to be biased and on the lookout for DAP. But the problem with that is that those same people who are kind of setting the agenda for said conferences, talking at said conferences, appear not to considering that they themselves might be biased on DAP and on the lookout for it. And it kind of NAS is important. The National Autistic Society is important because it supported DAP since 2007, but it recognised it as a form of autism in 2015. But National Autistic Society is essentially the largest source of information for autism in the UK. So it has quite a big outreach and pull. So what is being said about it can be taken seriously by quite a few different persons. And so the fact that this committee of people who have been controlling NASA's information is quite important. And yeah, more recently, NASA have told me they've basically stopped PDA Development Group from organising its DAP conferences and its online information. I'm not entirely sure why they've done that, but they just have done. I also kind of need to point out within the literature, so Phil Christie has been on various Autism Education Trust boards. So the Autism Education Trust is a quango that's been funded by the government to help raise standards in the primary and secondary education settings in relation to autistic pupils. So in 2012, Phil Christie was elected to one of its boards, and the Autism Education Trust republished Christie's 2007 article on DAP, which is basically suggested strategies for working with DAP pupils. So what's then happened later on is that Phil Christie has co-authored articles which has mentioned AAT support of DAP, and also mentioned that the Autism Education Trust has published educational guidelines for DAP, but they haven't mentioned Phil Christie's involvement on the Autism Education Trust boards, or that is basically republished Phil Christie's article. Also worth mentioning that that Christie himself has also been involved with kind of either kind of advising or kind of being involved in development of the Bemis Understood Report kind of questionnaire booklet. So yeah, he's been involved in kind of campaigning efforts for it as well. And this stuff is also not widely kind of acknowledged and spoken about in ADAPT literature. And there's a kind of obvious kind of conflicts of interest here. I also should have mentioned that Phil Christie himself is an independent autism/DAP consultant. So one would argue that he's likely to benefit from it. And if you actually check the Autism Education Trust website, it does say that he's been involved in kind of many kind of training opportunities for stuff at school. So one could argue he's benefiting from it. More recently, the PDA Development Group is at the very least producing various guides for DAP Profile of ASD. If you check the PDA Society website, we don't really know who is on the PDA Development Group. I only know Judy Eaton's on there because I asked her and she told me. And Phil Christie is publicly acknowledged in a 2016 booklet by the PDA Society as being involved in the PDA Development Group. The PDA Society's website also states that the National Autistic Society and PDA Society has representation on there. But we don't really know who's on there, what they actually do, what they've done, and this matters because it's a conflict of interest because they potentially stand to benefit from their activities. You can argue that they have done. And as I said previously, ethically, they should / must be declaring conflict of interest. More practical perspective of it, from the quality of the research coming out on DAP, if we don't know who's on the PDA Development Group, it means that we can't investigate if conflicts of interest are potentially adversely impacting the quality of DAP literature and impacting research results on the topic. So it is a problem, and it does undermine the integrity of DAP scholarship. There's not really any other way to view it. I'm kind of going on to how kind of DAP's nature, how DAP Profile of ASD can be used to control various persons. So the first point to point out is that the DAP features lack specificities. They're not specific to that. They're quite universal. So if I go back to this diagram, it's like a magpie. It's got a spiky profile. It's got features from many accepted constructs, not even from your own diagram, also from loads of Nion's diagram. So yeah. Also, the nature of the kind of questionnaires, they're kind of they're lacking specific items, and they're basically vague and generic, and often rely on kind of caregiver reports. The DAP feature said they overlap many accepted constructs and common kind of co-occurring conditions for autism. The point is, it's very easy for someone to identify with DAP if they wish to, and it's a particular case because there's multiple different DAP profiles in diagnostic behavior profiles in print, so you can pick whichever one suits you if you wanted to. And there are signs of autistic kind of children, young person, adults kind of internalizing kind of DAP profile ASD kind of discourse. So it does seem to be an issue happening. So you kind of consider the kind of broader kind of cultural impact on how autistic persons kind of faring in kind of in society. We're kind of generally reported kind of quite harshly and quite poorly by society. So that kind of often leads to us having quite poor mental health, mental ill health, and having kind of a lot of kind of recurring mental disorder diagnoses, such as depression or anxiety or various anxiety disorders. So Monique Bertha kind of conducted research into minority stress. So minority stress is a concept to explain how minorities are kind of adversely affected by kind of majority kind of society kind of norms and practices and standards. When you kind of consider it, it turns out that most of kind of autistic mental ill health is caused by a minority stress, but basically by how crappily we are treated by non-autistic society. What she also found, which is quite interesting, is that being involved in the autistic community can help mitigate / protect from the adverse impact of minority stress. And this matters because if you're having many autistic persons or a substantial minority of autistic persons identifying with DAP and forming a community around the notion of the DAP profile of ASD, and they're kind of making a positive, supporting community around it, the effect of that is that the DAP profile ASD is likely to also act as a buffer against the effects of minority stress. So what I'm trying to say is that one should be able to predict that the DAP profile of ASD would create a bubble within the autistic population. Likewise, one would also predict that there would be internalized ableism would occur. Internalized ableism is when an oppressed population demographic internalizes discourses that are used to oppress it, and therefore re-emits the oppressive discourses within the oppressed population demographic. So some autistic persons who identify with DAP profile of ASD have been attacking people who have been critiquing it. Quite well-known example is when Sally Cat kind of did a petition to try and have Damien Milson fired from the National Autistic Society in 2018. So we kind of move on to kind of caregivers. If you consider the nature of kind of the DAP strategies, which I probably could have gone into in more detail, that basically involve kind of negotiating, offering choices, kind of reducing demands, kind of being indirect, with kind of praise and kind of phrasing requests, and kind of offering choice, but it only tends to be like 2 or 3 choices, so you're not overwhelming the person. But basically, it's been noted that caregivers would often request DAP diagnosis as a proxy for accessing better support packages. And the thing with DAP is it's meant to be there because it has its own unique set of strategies. So often, children and young persons will have a DAP diagnosis and have a particular set of strategies set to them. And so basically, for caregivers, their child, which they often have to fought very hard and potentially invest quite a bit of money into getting a DAP diagnosis, or getting it recognised at schools or locally and nationally, they're likely to be quite protective over the DAP profile ASD if it underpins their child support packages. And to me, it's quite reasonable to kind of empathise with a kind of caregiver's perspective at this point. And it's also quite important to note that often the kind of DAP profile ASD can be quite a powerful experience to discover it online when a kind of caregiver hears about it, because the DAP profile itself is quite unique. It contrasts a lot against kind of autism stereotypes, and for example, so has quite a powerful pull when person comes across. It's kind of called the light bulb moment. As a construct, it has high base validity. It seems to work. It seems to describe what's going on with a child. So it's kind of the lack of kind of recognition for DAP kind of predisposes kind of caregivers to kind of campaign for it, to kind of be protective over kind of the construct and over kind of DAP profile kind of ASD kind of proponents. So it can be quite easy to see that kind of there's a huge power differential between kind of caregivers and kind of those advocating and kind of portraying DAP as a profile, DAP profile of ASD, and that kind of caregivers are likely to kind of support them. So one point out here, it's kind of really important that kind of balance, accurate information on that is kind of given to caregivers, because the power differential is at play. So yeah, there's some quite clever bit of imagery and kind of phrasing that's used with that profile of ASD. So it's kind of symbol. It's kind of giant panda, and it's partly kind of playing the word, the name panda, because obviously PDA and kind of panda, which is obviously just PA, Papa Alpha November Delta Alpha, how you spell panda. So when you kind of look at the connotations attached to a giant panda, they're often similar or the same connotations attached to PDA profile ASD kind of narrative. So like individual PDA kind of thrive in the right environments with specific adjustments or strategies tailored to the needs, just like a giant panda. More broadly, kind of like pandas are rare, and they must have campaigning to support the needs, have specific approaches that work for them. There's very limited space to accommodate giant pandas in the wild or anywhere in the globe, because giant pandas, they obviously have a unique diet. They need to have a lot of bamboo to sustain them, because it's a very poor nutritional source. So there's literally a very limited amount of kind of space for them to be at the moment in the world. So the reason why I'm saying this is it kind of goes back to around kind of the efforts to kind of maintain the integrity of the DAP profile of ASD and kind of maintain how it's understood and kind of kind of conceptualised at the moment. It's kind of similar kind of arguments. It must be a rare form of autism, and we can't expand it or whatever. What I'm trying to say is like the entire notion of having a DAP, associating kind of DAP with the giant panda, kind of reinforces certain notions around it. Yeah, I need to be I'm getting towards the end of the talk now, literally. So I'm going to be quite clear about what I am saying, what I'm not saying. So it's quite clearly is nonsensical to view DAP as a profile of autism. It's also kind of clearly severely problematic to view for DAP profile of ASD to be a culture-bound concept to the UK. In my view, it never should have happened. And yeah, it's not something I'm particularly happy with, but one can go about kind of critiquing and challenging, and there are methods that there are kind of standard ways to do this academically. I need to be quite clear that no one is saying that the challenges and difficulties that those with DAP face are not real or don't exist. So, because a lot of the many people who identify or have a DAP diagnosis, they will often face kind of quite severe difficulties with demands from others or kind of internal demands, and this kind of needs to be validated and accepted, and also we do need to recognise those identifying with DAP or have a DAP diagnosis, and their kind of cases do require appropriate support, however that's kind of conceptualised and kind of given either by a DAP diagnosis independent of autism, or kind of transdiagnostically, which some people have been putting forward, and it can be done transdiagnostically because standard practice in kind of mental health literature is that kind of treatments or interventions are kind of issues / symptom specific. They're not diagnoses or disorder specific. So yeah, going forward, this is my conclusion. So going forward, we should respect autistic persons, which is to not divide the autistic spectrum, because most autistic persons do not want it to be divided. Quite clearly, DAP is not a profile of autism. Can we stop pretending that it is? It's important to recognise that non-autistic persons with DAP have equal rights to diagnosis, research and support. And also should be taking a scientific method-based approach to DAP. So we should be systematically researching different outlooks of DAP. So can it be conceptualized as a form of attachment disorder or personality disorder? And we should test those conceptualizations, because presently how the tools around DAP essentially all view it to be a form of autism. So it's a bit pointless to try and test it as a form of attachment disorder if the tool isn't designed to allow that to happen. I should also soon be kind of having my first PhD study. So please, could you take part in my PhD research? So yeah, the next is just the end of it. So there's kind of my contact details, so like my email address, my Twitter handle, my ResearchGate profile, which has all my kind of research outputs on. You can also get on my research outputs. Mainly my research profile has them all on, but the couple of ones. One is my London South Bank University's open research profile on the uni's repository, or I've got a couple of pieces on one open access service, which is OSF. So that's Oscar Sierra Foxtrot. So yeah. So I'm just going to kind of go through references briefly. Yeah, this has been quite substantially referenced. There's about 90 references and more on here. So I'm not going to linger long on them, because you should be able to pause the video to trace up any references that you want. So yeah. So yeah, thank you again, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And this is the last one. So bye, and thank you again.